The atmosphere does not forgive, and the ocean does not negotiate. When an aluminum airframe sits in a shaded revetment for roughly 75 years, it can settle into a fragile chemical equilibrium with its environment. The forest canopy, and whatever glazing remains, acts as a filter, reducing ultraviolet exposure and moderating the thermal cycles that drive expansion and contraction. The vines and overgrowth, while invasive, often function as a structural cradle, holding heavy components in place long after the tires have rotted away. This creates a deceptive stability. The aircraft looks intact, but the metal has lost its elasticity, and many fasteners can become effectively seized by corrosion products, behaving like a single lock joint rather than a serviceable connection. The moment a recovery team clears the vegetation and relocates the airframe into an open, coastal staging environment, that equilibrium can be shattered. The clock does not just restart, it accelerates. This is the technical reality that governed the extraction of a Mitsubishi G4M1 Model 11, the Imperial Japanese Navy Type A11 attack bomber known to the Allies as Betty. This specific airframe, identified in published documentation as manufacture number 2806, built at Mitsubishi's Nagoya No. 3 works in May 1943, was not a crash site casualty. It was a relic of operational abandonment. In 1943, Ballale Airfield came under sustained Allied raids and bombardment. By mid-October 1943, it was neutralized as a forward airfield, and flyable aircraft were withdrawn northward. In that environment, resupply and maintenance collapsed, and non-flyable airframes were left behind in their revetments. Aircraft 2806 was not shot down in flames. It was left in an earthen revetment at Ballale Airfield, and over time the vegetation closed over it as the warfront shifted north. For the aviation archaeologist, this distinction between a crash wreck and an abandonment wreck is critical. A crash wreck is a debris field defined by high-energy impact forces, fragmentation, and fire. An abandonment wreck is a complete machine that has been slowly dismantled by entropy. The G4M1 was designed with a specific vulnerability that earned it the dark nickname of the flying cigarette lighter among American pilots. Its massive wing tanks lacked self-sealing rubber layers, making the aircraft prone to catastrophic fire when hit in combat. However, on the ground at Ballale, this fragility was irrelevant. The threat was not incendiary rounds, but the slow, grinding process of galvanic corrosion. During August 2018, the bomber was recovered by a foreign salvager and moved across Ballale Island to the beach to await export. The immediate objective was extraction and staging, not guaranteed restoration. This required moving the aircraft from the stable, shaded interior of the island to a staging area on the beach. This decision introduced a new and immediate constraint. The interior of the island is humid, but it is shielded from the direct chloride spray of the breaking surf. The beach staging area is a corrosion accelerator. Once the aircraft was towed to the shoreline, it was exposed to salt mist and intense tropical sun, creating a rapid spike in surface degradation. Before any intervention, the team needed two things: positive identification and a handling plan that would prevent the long, semi-monocoque fuselage from deforming once wing center section stiffness and normal support points were disturbed during disassembly. The team faced a binary choice. They could leave the aircraft in the jungle, where it would slowly disappear under the vegetation over the next century, or they could intervene. Intervention meant cutting the aircraft into transportable sections, breaking the rust bonds that had held it together since 1943, and exposing it to the harsh coastal elements. The risk was that the recovery effort itself would cause more damage in 2 weeks than the jungle had caused in 7 decades. The operation at Ballale was not just a logistical movement of heavy equipment. It was a race against a sudden shift in chemical conditions, where the prize was one of the last intact examples of a pivotal naval bomber, and the penalty for delay was the rapid disintegration of its skin. This triggered the preservation paradox. The act of rescue accelerated the very corrosion it was meant to stop. To understand why the aircraft survived long enough to be recovered, look at the ground reality of 1943. The bomber was abandoned in its revetment and cannibalized. Wreck documentation notes that neither engine was present on the airframe, and they were presumed to have been removed during the war for repair or parts. Once the airfield was neutralized and crews departed, The canopy over the revetment damped sunlight and thermal cycling, slowing paint loss and some modes of weathering. However, gravity never paused. Decades on, collapsed or seized landing gear can distort a long fuselage, especially once normal stiffness and support paths are altered during recovery. Hogging occurs when the fuselage sags due to a loss of rigidity along its longitudinal axis. Without the tension provided by the skin and the stringers acting in unison, the nose and tail may droop if the center is supported, or the center may belly out if the nose and tail are held up by debris. On Ballale, the vegetation that covered the aircraft effectively shored up these sagging sections, creating a natural cradle. The vines held the components in place relative to one another. Extraction removed the jungle's passive bracing and exposed the fuselage to unshielded sun and a salt-laden atmosphere at the shoreline. In that chloride zone, surface degradation accelerates rapidly. In the chloride zone, mixed metal joints that were stable in the jungle can lock solid or fail rapidly, especially where magnesium, steel, and aluminum meet. With the airframe now in a chloride zone, the next priority was documentation. Before corrosion erased the markings that proved what had been saved. Identification is a race against paint loss. Before any lift, the team documented the airframe in situ, photographs, measurements, and close-ups of every surviving marking, so evidence could not be lost during movement. On the vertical stabilizer, later surveys reported only U3 clearly legible, with the final digits degraded. Earlier visitors and records support the full code as U321 or possibly U2321. The data plate confirmed manufacturer number 2806. Taken together, the markings and published attribution lock the identity and associate the airframe with the 705 Kokotai and its 1943 U-series codes. That verified provenance justified intervention. This was not just a type example, but a documented survivor tied to a specific unit and campaign. The discipline of in situ conservation also revealed the limits of what could be known. The survey showed that while the identity was certain, the integrity of the airframe was variable. The cockpit section and the wing roots were intact, but the fabric control surfaces on the elevators and rudder had long since rotted away, leaving only the metal frames. The glazing on the nose and dorsal turret was missing or shattered, allowing water to enter the fuselage interior. With the identity locked as 2806 and the unit confirmed as the 705th, the survey phase was effectively closed. The question of what was sitting in the revetment had been answered. The operation now pivoted to the question of how to move it, but the wing roots were not held together by fresh bolts. They were held together by steel pins that had been rusting into aluminum sockets since the Truman administration. The team now faced a mechanical paradox. They had to separate the wings to save the plane, but applying the force required to pull them apart risked shattering the main spar. The primary obstacle to recovering a Mitsubishi G4M1 is geometry. The aircraft spans 82 feet from wingtip to wingtip. The jungle tracks on Ballale Island are narrow, winding paths cut for light vehicles, not for a wide body bomber. To extract the airframe without cutting down a swathe of the forest, the recovery team had to reduce the dimensions of the object. This meant separating the outer wing panels from the fuselage. In practice, separating the wing roots meant defeating corrosion-locked mixed metal joints. The G4M1 wing root is a textbook example of this electrochemical battery. The structure relies on steel spar bolts passing through aluminum housings, often using magnesium fittings as washers or spacers. Magnesium is an anodic metal, meaning it is highly active and willing to surrender electrons. Steel is cathodic. Over 7 decades, the magnesium components effectively sacrificed themselves to protect the steel, swelling as they oxidized. This process locked the fasteners in place with a force that defies standard hand tools. Applying excessive torque to these seized bolts risks shattering the surrounding aluminum structure. The engineers could not simply shear the bolts without destroying the spar integrity. Instead, disassembly became an exercise in controlled force and improvisation. The salvager fitted a double-wheel dolly, weighted the nose interior to keep it stable while rolling, and cut the rear fuselage behind the waist blisters to make the sections transportable. This was a slow, methodical process of reversing 75 years of molecular fusion. Once the wings were separated, the multi-ton fuselage presented a different stability challenge. Without the wings to provide stiffness, the long cigar shape acts like a flexible tube. To move it, the team could not simply drag it across the rough terrain. They had to construct a rigid sled or cradle that supported the airframe along its entire keel, preventing the nose and tail from drooping and buckling the skin. The extraction equipment itself was a study in adaptation. There were no specialized aircraft recovery cranes available on the remote island. Instead, the recovery relied on improvised handling. A pathway was cut from the airfield to the beach, sections were shifted using makeshift sleds and wheeled dollies, and the airframe was staged at the shoreline for onward shipment. The method worked, but it traded finesse for inevitability, controlled movement, limited support points, and constant risk of skin buckling whenever the load path shifted. The journey ended at the beach staging area, a distance of only about 300 yards from the jungle edge, but a world away in terms of chemical exposure. This move activated the mechanism known as the chloride trap. A chloride trap forms when salt particles from the sea spray settle into the micropores of the metal surface and the lap joints between panels. These salts are hygroscopic, meaning they actively absorb moisture from the air. Even if the aircraft is covered with a tarp, the salt trapped against the skin continues to pull water out of the humidity, creating a concentrated corrosive solution that eats into the aluminum 24 hours a day. By moving the aircraft to the beach, the team had solved the access problem but created a preservation emergency. They had successfully disassembled the giant, navigated the jungle track, and staged the machine for export. The physical recovery was a success. The aircraft was ready to be loaded onto a barge and shipped to a restoration facility where the chloride could be washed away. But as the technical team prepared the rigging for the final lift, the operation hit a barrier that no amount of penetrating oil could loosen. By late 2018, the plan was to load the staged components and export them to a facility capable of arresting corrosion. Then the operation hit a legal hard stop. The decision to block the export was not a technical failure, but a shift in the definition of value. Local controversy and administrative uncertainty overtook the engineering plan. The Ballale War Relics project was suspended in December 2018 amid concerns about the removal and potential shipment of relics, and the staged wreckage remained in limbo until it was shipped onward to Guadalcanal by late March 2019. This created a profound conflict between two opposing models of preservation. The first model prioritizes material integrity, arguing that a rare aluminum structure should be sent to wherever the industrial capacity exists to save it. The second model prioritizes territorial custody, arguing that the artifact belongs to the land where it was abandoned, even if that means accepting a lower standard of conservation. This administrative deadlock had immediate physical consequences. The aircraft was stranded in the staging area. For an extended interval after the August 2018 beach staging through the project's December 2018 suspension, the wreckage remained exposed until the March 2020 shipment to Guadalcanal. During this period, it sat fully exposed to the coastal environment, trapped in the very chloride zone the engineers had raced to escape. The preservation paradox, which had been a theoretical risk during the extraction, became the dominant operational reality. The jungle had protected the airframe for 75 years. The beach began to consume it in months. Attempts were made to mitigate the damage while the legal dispute played out. Reports describe repainting efforts, including dark green paint that did not adhere reliably in the prevailing conditions, and yellow paint applied to prominent exterior areas. The deeper issue was not the color of the coating, but the environment. Repeated wetting, salt-laden air, and time. The visible failure of these coatings became a marker of the larger problem, an artifact staged in a coastal corrosion zone without the infrastructure required to stabilize it. The pivot point came in 2020. It became clear that the next step would not be a clean, immediate departure from the coastal zone. The binary choice was no longer between export or jungle. It was between indefinite decay on the beach or a compromise solution within the country. The decision was made to relocate the aircraft, not to a foreign restoration shop, but to a domestic industrial storage facility. This selection defined the outcome path. The aircraft would not be restored to flight status. It would not be polished to a mirror finish for a museum in the United States or Australia. It would remain in the Solomon Islands, preserved as a static, unrestored hull. This choice accepted a specific trade-off. The chain of custody would remain unbroken, satisfying the legal requirement for national ownership, but the technical ambition would be capped. The dream of a fully restored G4M1 flying again was traded for the reality of a secure but corroded survivor kept close to its point of origin. By locking in this decision, the stakeholders moved the objective from restoration to stabilization. The goal was no longer to reverse the damage, but simply to stop it from getting worse. The aircraft was loaded onto a barge, not for an ocean crossing, but for a short transit to Guadalcanal. The extraction from the jungle was a physical success, but the recovery operation as originally designed had been aborted in favor of a new, locally grounded mission. The question now was whether the facility in Honiara could provide the shelter necessary to honor the history that the jungle had kept safe for so long. For 2 years, the Mitsubishi G4M1 sat in the coastal staging area, caught in the chemical crossfire of the shoreline. The interval between 2018 and 2020 was a period of stasis for the legal paperwork, but a period of acceleration for the corrosion. When the final decision was executed to move the aircraft to Guadalcanal, the operation was no longer about rescue, it was about damage control. The priority shifted from preparing a pristine export to securing a deteriorating asset. The relocation to Honiara in 2020 marked the final link in a procedural sequence known as the chain of custody. In forensic recovery, chain of custody is the documented history of an object's control, transfer, and physical condition. It is the legal and technical thread that guarantees the artifact sitting in a storage shed today is the same one extracted from the jungle. For the Betty bomber number 2806, this chain is complex. It runs from the Imperial Japanese Navy to the jungle overgrowth, to the salvage team, and finally to the Solomon Islands government. Maintaining this chain is critical because without it, the provenance of the wreckage dissolves. A loose panel without a paper trail is just scrap. A panel with a verified chain of custody is history. The aircraft now resides in an industrial storage facility near Honiara. It is under a roof, finely shielded from the ultraviolet light and the direct rain that pummeled it for decades. However, the condition of the airframe reflects the violence of its timeline. By late January 2021, it was reported displayed with a tail section attached, likely sourced from a different early model G4M1 fuselage, underscoring how stabilization can blur into reconstruction. The nose section carries a distinct deformation, a legacy of a tree impact that occurred sometime after 1977. This crushing damage to the bombardier's glazing station was not caused by the war, but by the passive weight of the jungle during its long abandonment. It serves as a permanent scar of the years spent in the revetment. The preservation status of U-321 is best described as stable but uncorrected. The yellow primer that was applied during the beach holdover remains on the fuselage, peeling and faded, a visual testament to the failed preservation attempt. The magnesium fittings in the wing roots have been stabilized to stop active exfoliation, but the deep pitting caused by the salt exposure is irreversible. The aircraft has not been restored, it has not been reassembled into a flight-ready posture. Instead, the fuselage rests on supports, separated from its wings, a disjointed anatomy of aluminum and steel. This outcome represents a partial success. A total failure would have been leaving the aircraft to be consumed entirely by the jungle or dissolving on the beach. A total success would have seen it fully restored in a climate-controlled museum. The reality sits in the middle. The aircraft is safe from the elements, but it remains a static industrial object, hidden away in a storage shed rather than displayed to the public. The legacy of aircraft 2806 is defined by the limits of what can be saved. The recovery proved that the technical capacity to extract a massive bomber from a remote island exists. It also proved that the legal and political barriers to moving such an object are often more rigid than the airframe itself. The chain of custody remains unbroken, and the identity of the machine is locked. It is a tangible survivor of the 705th Kokutai, a rare example of Japanese naval engineering that outlasted the war, the jungle, and the salt. It waits now in the quiet darkness of a Honiara warehouse, a witness that was verified, moved, and secured, even if it was never fully set free.